The stunned expressions on my children's faces when they discovered I'd purchased both their mortgages while they were busy convincing a doctor I had dementia will remain etched in my memory forever. Their perfect plan to sell my home while I was safely tucked away at Sunshine Valley Care Center fell apart with one simple envelope from Sanderson Associates. My name is Eleanor Rogers, and at 70, I never expected my children's financial desperation would reveal which relationships in my life were built on genuine affection and which were crafted from calculated opportunism. The home my late husband, Robert, and I had lovingly restored over 4 decades became not just the center of our family memories, but the battleground for an unexpected war of wills. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This photograph was taken at my 70th birthday celebration just 3 months ago. My son Thomas stands beside me with that practiced smile he's perfected for business meetings. My daughter Patricia, Patty, as we've always called her, on my other side, with her husband Greg slightly behind us. We're all posed beneath the "Happy Birthday Mom" banner hanging in the sunroom of my colonial home on Maple Street, the home Robert and I purchased as a fixer-upper when the children were just starting elementary school. I thought we were still a functioning family despite their growing impatience with my stubborn independence, as they called it. How wrong I was. Robert's mother used to tell me, "Ellie, pay attention to what people do when they think no one important is watching. That's when they show you who they really are." Her wisdom became my lifeline when my own children decided I was no longer capable of making my own decisions, all while eyeing the considerable equity in my mortgage-free home. After Robert passed away 2 years ago, my relationship with Thomas and Patty began changing in subtle ways I initially misinterpreted as concern. Thomas, who had always been too busy with his real estate business to visit more than holidays, suddenly called weekly with questions about the house. How was I managing the yard? Wasn't the maintenance becoming too much? Had I considered what a burden the property taxes must be on my fixed income? Patty's approach was less subtle. "Mom, you're rattling around in this big house all alone," became her favorite phrase, always followed by links to condos and retirement communities. Her husband Greg, an investment advisor whose business had suffered some recent setbacks, would chime in with calculations about how much I could add to my retirement if I unlocked the equity in this outdated place. The first alarm bell rang when Thomas offered to streamline my finances. "Dad had all those complicated investments, Mom. Let me simplify things for you." When I explained that Robert and I had carefully planned our retirement with our financial advisor and everything was running smoothly, Thomas couldn't quite mask his irritation. "You shouldn't have to worry about these things at your age," he insisted, though I'd been handling our household accounts for 50 years. Their coordinated campaign intensified when I mentioned renovating the master bathroom to include accessibility features. "Why pour money into this old house?" Patty questioned, while Thomas immediately suggested it was the perfect time to sell instead. The market is hot right now. What they didn't know, what Robert and I had deliberately kept private, was that we had concerns about our children's financial management long before his diagnosis. Thomas had leveraged himself into 2 foreclosures over the years, always bouncing back with new ventures but never learning caution. Patty and Greg maintained a lifestyle well beyond their means, with private schools for their children and luxury vacations funded by home equity loans against a house they could barely afford. Robert had structured our estate thoughtfully, ensuring I would be comfortable while protecting the children from their own worst financial instincts. "They'll never learn if we keep bailing them out," he'd said sadly during one of our late-night discussions. "Better they face reality while we can still guide them through it." The crisis began when Patty suggested a family weekend at what she described as a lakeside resort. "You deserve a break, Mom," she insisted. "Thomas and I have arranged everything. You just need to pack for a week." My neighbor Barbara Johnson, a retired nurse who had become my closest friend since Robert's passing, raised concerns when I told her about the trip. It's odd they're so insistent about packing for a full week, when they originally mentioned a weekend, she observed. And why did Thomas ask me about your medication schedule for a family vacation? Barbara's questions amplified my own unease, but I dismissed them as paranoia. These were my children, after all. Surely they wouldn't deceive their own mother. The resort turned out to be Sunshine Valley Care Center, a modern facility with landscaped grounds and a memory care wing discreetly separated from the main building. What Thomas described as check-in procedures was actually an admission process, complete with a medical evaluation and cognitive assessment. The suite they'd reserved was a small room in the assisted living section. This is just until we complete some upgrades at the house, Thomas explained smoothly as an attendant took my suitcase. You're always saying the stairs are getting harder. We're having an elevator installed. I knew immediately something was wrong. I had never complained about the stairs, but played along while calculating my options. Years as an elementary school principal had taught me to recognize deception while maintaining a calm exterior. Dr. Anthony Reynolds appeared the following day for what was described as a standard wellness check for all guests. The examination focused extensively on memory and cognitive function, the date, the current president, simple arithmetic problems, and drawing a clock face. Classic dementia screening, though I didn't let on that I recognized the protocol from my years working with school psychologists. Over the next 3 days, Thomas or Patty visited daily, each bringing paperwork requiring signatures. Just insurance updates, Thomas assured me. Standard liability releases for the construction, Patty explained. I signed several documents, while insisting on keeping copies, another habit Robert had ingrained in me. When I requested time to read the fine print, their impatience was palpable, though quickly masked. Just routine stuff, Mom. Don't you trust us? Patty asked with a hint of challenge that only strengthened my resolve to understand exactly what I was signing. On the 4th night, Barbara arrived unannounced at Sunshine Valley, claiming to be my sister when questioned at reception. Her face told me everything before she spoke a word. Eleanor, they've listed your house for sale, she said without preamble. I saw the sign go up this morning, and David Sanderson called me when he couldn't reach you directly. David Sanderson had been Robert's attorney and friend for 30 years. He'd helped us execute the contingency plans Robert had insisted upon as his health declined, plans our children knew nothing about. There's more, Barbara continued, her nurse's training evident in her matter-of-fact delivery of difficult news. Thomas has filed for emergency guardianship claiming cognitive decline. They're using Dr. Reynolds' evaluation as evidence, along with some papers you apparently signed. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Not just the house. They were attempting to take control of my autonomy, my independence, my very self-determination. How quickly can David intervene? I asked, years of handling school crises helping me focus on solutions rather than emotions. He's already filing counter motions, Barbara assured me, but he needs you out of here to strengthen the case. Leaving proved surprisingly simple. When I approached the reception desk the following morning and stated I was checking out, the young administrator seemed confused. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mrs. Rogers, your children indicated this was a long-term placement. We don't have discharge orders. Am I under a court-ordered guardianship? I asked directly. No, ma'am, but then as a legally competent adult, I'm free to leave this facility at any time, I stated firmly. Unless you're prepared to explain to a judge why you're forcibly detaining a senior citizen against her will. 20 minutes later, Barbara and I were driving back to Maple Street, where we found a for sale sign prominently displayed in the yard I had so carefully tended since Robert's passing. Through the bay windows, we could see strangers moving. Through my home, measuring and photographing. I used my key to enter through the side door, Barbara following close behind. In the kitchen, we found Patty directing a home stager while discussing necessary updates to attract buyers in this price range. The shock on her face when she saw me standing in the doorway of my own home would have been comical under different circumstances. "Mom, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be at Sunshine Valley until the house sells. Until the renovations are complete." "I think we both know there are no renovations planned, Patty," I replied calmly. "Just as we both know I don't require memory care or assisted living." Thomas arrived minutes later, alerted by his sister's panicked call. His reaction shifted rapidly from surprise to anger. "This is ridiculous, Mom. You need supervised care. Dr. Reynolds confirmed it. The house is too much for you to manage alone. We're just trying to help you transition to appropriate housing." By declaring me incompetent? By selling my home without my knowledge or consent? I challenged. Is that how caring children typically help their parents? "You don't understand," Thomas insisted, his voice rising. "My business is underwater. The commercial property I invested in is worthless since the bypass rerouted traffic. I have creditors calling daily. And that justifies tricking me into a memory care facility and selling my home? The home your father and I worked our entire lives to secure?" "We would have made sure you were comfortable," Patty interjected, though she couldn't meet my eyes. "Sunshine Valley has very nice accommodations." "Accommodations I never agreed to," I pointed out. "Accommodations I was manipulated into under false pretenses." The confrontation was interrupted by David Sanderson's arrival. He entered with the confident bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades in courtrooms, carrying his signature leather portfolio. "Mrs. Rogers," he greeted me formally, though the relief in his eyes was evident. "I'm pleased to see you've returned home. I've brought the documents we discussed." This was a strategic move. We hadn't actually discussed any documents, but his implication that I'd been in contact with legal counsel all along undermined any suggestion I'd been isolated or uninformed. "Thank you, David," I replied, following his lead. "I believe it's time my children understand the complete situation." David placed his portfolio on the kitchen island and extracted several documents with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to creating dramatic effect in courtrooms. "First," he began professionally, "I have here the results of Mrs. Rogers' comprehensive neurological and cognitive evaluation performed by Dr. Elizabeth Chen at University Medical Center last month." He slid the document across the island. "As you can see, it conclusively demonstrates that Mrs. Rogers shows no signs of cognitive impairment, memory issues, or inability to manage her personal affairs." "You had an evaluation done?" Patty asked, confusion evident in her voice. "When I noticed your sudden interest in my cognitive health," I explained. "When you both started commenting on forgetfulness I wasn't experiencing and confusion that didn't exist, I decided to establish a medical baseline. Your father taught me to trust my instincts." David continued, producing another document. "Second, I have here Mrs. Rogers' durable power of attorney, executed and notarized 18 months ago, naming myself as her legal representative in the event she becomes incapacitated, with explicit instructions that neither Thomas nor Patricia Rogers are to be granted such authority under any circumstances." The shock on their faces made it clear this was completely unexpected. "Dad agreed to that?" Thomas asked incredulously. "Your father not only agreed, he initiated the conversation," I informed him. "He loved you both very much, but he had no illusions about your financial judgment." David laid out a third document. "Furthermore, I have notification that all documents allegedly signed by Mrs. Rogers during her stay at Sunshine Valley are being formally challenged as obtained under false pretenses or duress. I've already spoken with Dr. Reynolds, who admitted he was asked to perform a cognitive assessment without Mrs. Rogers' informed consent or knowledge of its purpose." "He told you that?" Patty's voice had grown small. People often become remarkably forthcoming when facing potential charges of elder abuse and medical ethics violations, David observed, particularly when the elder in question is former Principal Rogers, who still serves on the ethics committee at Riverdale Hospital. Thomas and Patty exchanged glances that betrayed their growing realization that their plan was unraveling. But it was the final document David produced that truly silenced the room. "Lastly, and perhaps most relevantly to your current financial concerns," he said, sliding forward 2 folders. "I have here the mortgage transfer documents executed 6 months ago, showing that Eleanor Rogers now holds the mortgages for both your primary residences." Thomas snatched up the documents, scanning them with increasingly frantic eyes. "This can't be legal. How could you possibly—" "Your father and I were concerned about both your financial situations long before he passed," I explained calmly. "When neither of you heeded our advice about living within your means, we decided on a more direct approach. When Heartland Bank was acquired last year, they sold off portions of their mortgage portfolio. Your father and I created an LLC specifically to purchase your mortgages." "What does this mean?" Patty demanded, looking between David and me. "It means," David explained with professional detachment, "that your mother is effectively your landlord. She can foreclose on both properties if payments are missed, or adjust terms at her discretion." The implications settled heavily as Thomas and Patty began to comprehend the thoroughness with which their father and I had protected against exactly the scenario they had attempted to create. "Even if your guardianship petition had succeeded," David continued, "which it most certainly would not have, it would have given you no control over the LLC that holds your mortgages. Mrs. Rogers herself cannot dissolve the structure without my counter-signature as trustee." Thomas collapsed onto a kitchen stool, the fight visibly draining from him. "So what happens now?" he asked, defeat evident in every word. "That," I said firmly, "depends entirely on your next actions." Barbara, who had been silently observing this exchange, offered to leave. "I should give you privacy for this family discussion." "No," I said, reaching for her hand. "You've earned the right to be here more than some actual family members. Please stay." Turning back to my children, I took a deep breath and considered my words carefully. The anger and hurt I felt were justified, but beneath them lay a more complex emotion, a mother's enduring connection to her children, however flawed they might be. "Your father and I spent years discussing how to handle this exact scenario," I told them, my voice steady despite the emotion behind my words. "He recognized the patterns in your financial behavior long before I was willing to acknowledge them. He wanted to protect me, but he also wanted to protect you both from your own worst financial tendencies." "Protect us by controlling our homes?" Thomas scoffed, though his indignation lacked conviction. "Protect you from thinking that my home and savings were your safety net," I corrected. "The LLC doesn't just secure my property, Thomas. It establishes a pathway for both of you to achieve actual financial stability, if you're willing to follow it." David nodded, opening another section of his portfolio. "The operating agreement includes provisions for debt restructuring, financial counseling, and potential forgiveness of portions of the mortgage principal upon completion of an approved financial rehabilitation program." Patty looked up, surprise evident on her face. "Dad built all that into the agreement?" "Your father loved you enough to recognize your weaknesses without rejecting you for having them," I said softly. "He created a structure that would provide support without enabling self-destruction, something I failed to do by trying to protect you from consequences for too many years." The revelation seemed to pierce through Thomas's defensive anger. "So, we could have gotten help with our financial problems just by asking? Without all this?" He gestured vaguely around my kitchen, now filled with strangers' furniture used for staging. "Not just asking," David clarified. "Participating in the programs established by the LLC, financial counseling, budgeting assistance, career guidance where needed, structured support rather than blank checks. But yes, I added, you could have received substantial help without resorting to having your mother declared incompetent and institutionalized. The blunt phrasing landed heavily, as I had intended. Sometimes healing requires acknowledging the full extent of the wound. What will you do now? Patty asked, fear replacing defensiveness in her expression. Are you going to foreclose? Press charges? It was the question I had been asking myself since Barbara had revealed their scheme. The betrayal warranted serious consequences. Part of me wanted them to face the full weight of their actions, the elder abuse, the fraud, the breathtaking betrayal of basic human decency. But another part, the part that remembered them as children, that recognized how Robert's financial success had perhaps inadvertently set them up for failure by never requiring true self-reliance, hesitated at the finality of that path. That depends, I said after a long pause. I'm prepared to forgo both foreclosure and legal action under very specific conditions. David raised an eyebrow. This part clearly hadn't been discussed in our earlier planning. I gave him a small nod indicating I knew what I was doing. First, you will both immediately engage with the financial rehabilitation program established in the LLC agreement. Not just nominally, but with genuine commitment to changing the patterns that led us here. Neither protested, which I took as a positive sign. Second, you will each provide meaningful community service. Thomas at the Senior Legal Aid Clinic downtown, and Patty at the Riverdale Senior Center's financial literacy program. Perhaps some direct exposure to the elderly population you were so ready to consign me to will develop your apparently lacking empathy. Thomas winced but nodded. Patty actually looked somewhat intrigued by her assignment. Third, and most importantly, you will both participate in family counseling with me. What happened here goes beyond financial schemes. It represents a fundamental breach of trust and family bonds that needs addressing if we're to have any relationship moving forward. I looked each of my children in the eye, searching for signs of genuine remorse rather than merely being caught and outmaneuvered. What I saw was complex. Shame, certainly, but also confusion and hurt that suggested their moral compasses weren't entirely broken, just severely miscalibrated after years of prioritizing financial achievement above all else. I don't know if our relationship can be repaired, I admitted honestly, but your father would have wanted us to try. The question is whether you're willing to do the difficult work that requires. The silence that followed was weighted with decades of family history, recent betrayal, and the uncertain possibility of redemption. For the first time since discovering their scheme, I saw something in both their expressions that gave me pause. Not justification or defensive anger, but the dawning recognition of how thoroughly they had violated something precious and potentially irreplaceable. It would be weeks before I knew whether that recognition represented the beginning of genuine change or merely another manipulation. But as David gathered his documents and Barbara squeezed my hand in silent support, I felt a surprising sense of peace amidst the pain. My home was secure, my autonomy was protected, and the wisdom of my late husband had guided me through perhaps the most difficult challenge of my life. The choice is yours, I told my children as David prepared to leave. But choose quickly. My patience, unlike my legal options, has an expiration date. 2 weeks later, I sat in Dr. Lisa Moretti's waiting room, mentally preparing for our first family counseling session. Barbara, who had driven me as she did for all important appointments, now provided quiet support. "How are you feeling about today?" she asked, her nurse's training evident in her matter-of-fact approach to emotional triage. "Cautiously optimistic," I replied, the phrase having become something of a mantra. Thomas actually called yesterday to confirm the time without being prompted. These small gestures, an unprompted phone call, Patty bringing coffee without an agenda, Thomas offering to help with yard work, had begun to accumulate into something that, while not yet trust, was at least movement in that direction. Doctor. Moretti's office door opened, and she greeted me with professional warmth. Eleanor, good to see you. Thomas and Patricia are already here. I nodded to Barbara, our established signal that I was comfortable proceeding alone, and followed Dr. Moretti inside where my children waited. The seating arrangement told its own story of our evolving dynamics. 2 weeks ago, they would have huddled together like co-conspirators. Today, they sat in separate chairs, each owning their individual responsibility rather than presenting a united front. Dr. Moretti began by acknowledging this was just the beginning of a long process. She'd made clear in our individual consultation that reconciliation after such a significant breach of trust would take time, if it was possible at all. Eleanor, would you like to open by sharing your thoughts? She prompted. I took a moment to organize my words, aware they carried significant weight in this delicate rebuilding process. 2 weeks ago, I discovered my children had conspired to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized for financial gain. I began directly, using the clear language Dr. Moretti had encouraged, rather than softening the reality of what had happened. Today, I'm sitting in a room with them voluntarily, which represents progress I wasn't certain was possible. Thomas studied the carpet, his jaw tight with what I had come to recognize as shame rather than defensiveness. Patty's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I've seen initial efforts from both of you, I continued. Thomas, your work at the legal aid clinic has begun. Patty, your reports from the financial literacy program show genuine engagement rather than just checking boxes. These weren't easy commitments to make or keep. It's the least we could do, Patty said quietly. After what we tried to... She stopped, still struggling with directly naming their actions. After we betrayed your trust and tried to take your home, Thomas finished for her, the blunt acknowledgement representing a step forward. Early conversations had been filled with justifications and minimizations. We were just trying to help. You would have been taken care of. The house was becoming too much for you. Dr. Moretti nodded approvingly at Thomas's straightforward statement. That kind of direct accountability is important. How does it feel, Thomas, to name the action so clearly? Terrible, he admitted, but necessary. I can't change something I won't even acknowledge doing. This represented significant progress from the angry, defensive man who had first entered therapy, viewing it merely as a way to avoid foreclosure. As the session continued, we began the difficult work of unpacking how we had arrived at such a profound breach of trust. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary, not just for potential reconciliation, but for my children's growth as human beings capable of genuine empathy, rather than seeing others, even family members, as means to financial ends. When we parted in the parking lot afterward, we adopted our newly established ritual, a brief hug that acknowledged our biological connection without pretending our relationship had returned to normal. As they walked to their separate cars, I saw Barbara waiting in hers nearby, her presence a reminder of the authentic friendship that had proven more reliable than family ties in my moment of crisis. How did it go? She asked as I settled into the passenger seat. Another step forward, I replied. Small but real. As we drove away, I reflected on the past 2 weeks, the painful conversations, the gradual shifts in understanding, the tentative rebuilding of connections I had once thought permanently destroyed. The house that had become the center of so much conflict remained my home, secured by Robert's foresight and my own determination not to be erased from my life story. But the true transformation hadn't been about property at all. It had been about recognizing that family is defined not by obligation or biology alone, but by how we choose to treat each other when difficult truths are finally brought to light. 6 months after discovering my children's scheme, I stood in my kitchen preparing afternoon tea for Barbara's weekly visit. The familiar routine had become a touchstone in my life, a reminder that genuine friendship often proves more reliable than familial obligation. The kettle whistled just as the doorbell rang. Barbara let herself in, a privilege she'd earned during those crucial days when she had quite literally rescued me from my children's plans. "I brought those lemon scones from Bradley's bakery," she called, making her way to the kitchen. "And news you should hear before your kids arrive later." My weekly family dinner with Thomas and Patty had become another touchstone, not always comfortable, but necessary for the rebuilding process we'd committed to. 6 months of weekly therapy with Dr. Moretti, financial counseling through the LLC program, and their community service had created a foundation for something I hesitated to call forgiveness, but might cautiously term reconstruction. "What news?" I asked, setting out teacups, my grandmother's china that had nearly been sold along with everything else in my home. Barbara placed the bakery box on the counter, her expression serious. "Thomas came to see me yesterday. He wanted to talk, without you present." A flicker of the old wariness returned. "About?" "The LLC's mortgage terms." Barbara poured tea for both of us. "He wanted my opinion on approaching you about modifying them." The wariness intensified. "He wants me to ease the restrictions?" "Actually, no." Barbara's expression softened. "He wants to accelerate the financial counseling requirements, take on additional sessions, more intensive budget monitoring. He says he's finally seeing real progress in getting his finances under control and wants to build on that momentum." I felt an unexpected surge of emotion, pride mixed with cautious hope. Thomas, who had once refused any suggestion that his financial instincts might be flawed, was now voluntarily seeking more oversight, not less. "What did you tell him?" I asked, working to keep my voice steady. "That he should talk to you directly, but that I was impressed by his initiative." Barbara took a thoughtful sip of tea. "This feels different, Eleanor, not like the performative cooperation we saw in those first weeks." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The early days after the confrontation had been marked by surface compliance, my children doing what was required to avoid the legal consequences I could have pursued, but with a sense of resentment simmering just below the surface. Recently, though, something had shifted. Thomas had begun asking substantive questions during his financial counseling sessions, according to the reports I received. Patty had expanded her hours at the senior center beyond the required minimum, developing a genuine connection with the elderly clients she counseled on budgeting basics. "They're coming for dinner at 6, I noted, glancing at the clock. "I'll talk to Thomas then." When they arrived that evening, I noticed immediately that something was different. They entered together, but without the united front they had once presented. Their body language suggested individual purpose rather than coordinated agenda. "I made pot roast," I said, ushering them into the dining room where the table was already set. "Robert's recipe." The mention of their father no longer created the uncomfortable silence it once had. 6 months of therapy had allowed us to speak more honestly about Robert, not just as their father or my husband, but as a man who had recognized his children's weaknesses and tried, however imperfectly, to protect them from themselves. "Dad would approve of what you've done with the house," Patty remarked, gesturing to the newly reupholstered dining chairs. "It looks fresher without losing the character." "That's precisely what I was aiming for," I replied, genuinely pleased. She had noticed. The small renovation projects I'd undertaken in recent months had been part of reclaiming my space, asserting that this home remained mine, to modify or maintain as I saw fit. As we settled around the table, Thomas cleared his throat nervously. "Mom, I wanted to talk to you about something." "Barbara mentioned you'd been to see her," I acknowledged, cutting directly to the heart of the matter as had become our practice during months of therapy. "About the mortgage terms." Patty looked surprised. "You talked to Barbara without telling me?" This, too, represented progress. 6 months ago, they would have coordinated any approach to me, presenting a unified strategy. Now, they were increasingly operating as individuals, each taking responsibility for their own relationship with me. "It's about my situation specifically," Thomas explained to his sister before turning back to me. "Mom, I've been thinking about what Dad was trying to accomplish with the LLC structure. Not just protecting you, but creating a pathway for genuine financial stability for us." I nodded, encouraging him to continue. "The counseling has been..." He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Illuminating. I've spent my entire adult life chasing quick financial wins, leveraging one property to buy another, always convinced the next deal would be the one that made everything secure. It never occurred to me that security doesn't work that way." The self-awareness in his statement caught me by surprise. "What are you proposing, Thomas?" "I'd like to modify my participation in the financial rehabilitation program, not to reduce it, but to intensify it." He pulled a folder from his jacket pocket, placing it carefully beside his plate. "I've drafted a more comprehensive plan with my counselor. Additional monitoring, stricter spending parameters, a complete restructuring of my business model away from high-risk investments towards sustainable income streams." I studied my son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or performance. What I saw instead was something I hadn't witnessed in years: genuine humility mixed with determination. "May I see the plan?" I asked. As I reviewed the documents, Patty spoke up. "I've been thinking along similar lines, Mom. The work at the senior center has been eye-opening. These people worked their entire lives, saved carefully, did everything right, and still found themselves vulnerable to financial predators. Predators like us," Thomas added quietly. The blunt acknowledgement hung in the air for a moment. "Not like us anymore," Patty corrected. "At least, not if we commit to this process for real, not just to avoid foreclosure." I finished reviewing Thomas's proposal, impressed by its thoroughness and the clear influence of the financial counselor's expertise. "This is comprehensive," I acknowledged. "What prompted this new direction?" Thomas exchanged a glance with his sister before answering. "Last week at the legal aid clinic, I helped an elderly man whose son had manipulated him into signing over his house. Claimed he was just helping manage the property, but actually took out a second mortgage against it to fund his own business." He paused, visibly uncomfortable with the parallel to his own actions. I sat across from this devastated man who couldn't understand how his own child could betray him that way. And suddenly I was looking at myself through Dad's eyes, seeing exactly what he must have seen when he created those protections in the LLC. Patty nodded. "For me, it was working with Mrs. Abernathy at the center. Her children cleaned out her savings while she was recovering from surgery, told her they were managing her finances during her recovery. She has nothing left, Mom. She's living on Social Security and subsidized housing because her own kids saw her as an ATM rather than a person." The genuine emotion in my children's voices suggested something had fundamentally shifted in their perspective. Not instantly, not completely, but meaningfully. The slow transformation that can only come through sustained exposure to consequences and alternatives. "I'll need to review these proposals with David," I said, closing Thomas's folder. "But I'm open to modifications that support genuine growth rather than simply easing restrictions." The relief on their faces was palpable. "There's something else we wanted to discuss," Patty said, glancing at Thomas for confirmation. "We've been talking about the house," Thomas continued. "Not about selling it," he added quickly, seeing my expression. "About making sure it remains yours, securely, for as long as you choose to live here." "What do you mean?" I asked. "We'd like to contribute to establishing a maintenance fund," Patty explained. "Not to control anything, but to ensure that if you need major repairs or modifications as you get older, the resources are there without touching your retirement savings. A trust," Thomas clarified, with Barbara as co-trustee to ensure we have no control over it. Just a way to contribute positively to your security rather than threatening it. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The children who had once conspired to sell my home out from under me, now proposing to help secure it for my future. Yet I recognized this too, as part of the healing process Dr. Moretti had outlined, concrete actions to address the specific harms they had caused. I'll consider it, I said carefully, though any such arrangement would need to be structured through David with appropriate safeguards. They both nodded, accepting without argument the need for continued boundaries and verification, another sign of genuine rather than performative change. As the evening continued, our conversation gradually shifted to more ordinary family matters, Thomas's daughter's college applications, Patty's volunteer work expanding beyond the senior center to include a financial literacy program at the local high school. Not the comfortable ease of a family untouched by betrayal, but not the tense calculation of our early post-confrontation interactions either. Later, after they had gone, I sat in my sunroom reflecting on the evening. The house around me, the home that had become the centerpiece of such dramatic conflict, felt different now. Not because of the small renovations I'd undertaken, but because I occupied it differently. Not as a widow maintaining her late husband's domain, nor as a mother whose children viewed her property as their future inheritance, but as a woman in her own right, entitled to the space she had earned through decades of work and care. Barbara called to check in, as she often did after these family dinners. "How did it go with Thomas's proposal?" she asked. "Better than expected," I admitted. "There seems to be genuine change happening, not just strategic compliance." "People can surprise you," Barbara observed. "Sometimes even for the better." As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself drawn to the photograph album I kept on my bedside table. The carefully preserved images told the story of our family across decades, Thomas and Patty as children, teenagers, young adults, parents themselves. The progression provided context for the present moment, not excusing their betrayal, but reminding me that people are more complex than their worst actions. Robert had understood this complexity when he established the protective measures that had ultimately saved me from our children's scheme. He hadn't simply written them off as irredeemably selfish or grasping. Instead, he had created structures that acknowledged their weaknesses while still offering pathways toward better choices. 6 months after discovering their betrayal, I wasn't ready to declare our family healed or even certain it ever would be completely. But as I closed the photo album and turned out the light, I felt a sense of cautious hope that hadn't been present in those first raw days after the confrontation. Not because I had forgotten or minimized what they had done, but because I was witnessing what might be genuine growth emerging from its aftermath. The house remained mine, secured through Robert's foresight and my own determination, but its meaning had evolved beyond mere property to become a symbol of autonomy preserved and, perhaps eventually, trust cautiously rebuilt through actions rather than promises. 1 year after the confrontation in my kitchen, I sat in my garden watching the autumn leaves drift from the maple trees Robert and I had planted when we first bought the house. Their brilliant orange and gold hues caught the afternoon sunlight, creating patterns across the flagstone path we had laid together during our first summer on Maple Street. The past year had brought changes I could never have anticipated 12 months ago, not just in my relationships with Thomas and Patty, but in my understanding of family, forgiveness, and the complex interplay between accountability and healing. David's black sedan pulled into the driveway right on schedule. He had always been punctual, one of the many qualities Robert had valued in both his friend and attorney. I watched as he gathered his leather portfolio and made his way up the garden path, his silver hair catching the same autumn light as the falling leaves. "Eleanor," he greeted me warmly. "You look well." "I feel well," I replied, gesturing for him to take the chair opposite mine. "Tea?" Barbara made a fresh pot before she left for her doctor's appointment. "Please," He nodded, settling into the chair and placing his portfolio on the small table between us. How is Barbara? Her knee still giving her trouble? She's scheduled for replacement surgery next month. I've arranged for her to recuperate here in the guest room. It's the least I can do after everything she's done for me. David smiled at that. Friendship returned in kind. Robert would approve. The mention of my late husband no longer brought the sharp pang it once had. 2 years after his passing, I had found a way to carry his memory that felt less like an open wound and more like a guiding presence. His foresight, after all, had quite literally saved me from our children's scheme. I've brought the annual review documents for the LLC, David said, opening his portfolio. And the reports from the financial counseling program. I thought we should discuss them before your dinner with Thomas and Patty tonight. The dinner had become a monthly tradition over the past year. Not always comfortable, especially in the early months, but increasingly meaningful as genuine change began to emerge from the initial crisis. How are they doing? I asked, accepting the folders David handed me. The real assessment, not just the formal report. David leaned back, considering. In my professional opinion, better than I ever anticipated. Thomas has completely restructured. His business approach moved away from high-risk property development to property management and maintenance. Smaller margins but consistent income. He's paid down 60% of his outstanding debt. And Patty? Even more surprising. She and Greg have downsized significantly, sold the house we hold the mortgage on, and purchased a much more modest home. Their new mortgage is well within their means. They've requested that the difference from the sale be placed in an educational trust for their children rather than returned to them directly. This indeed was unexpected. Patty and Greg had always prioritized presenting an image of success over actual financial stability. Their children attended expensive private schools they couldn't afford and participated in extracurricular activities chosen more for status than genuine interest. A trust? I asked, wanting to be sure I understood correctly. Not just redirecting the funds to another showcase home or luxury purchases. A properly structured educational trust, David confirmed, with disbursement conditions focused on vocational training and practical career preparation, not just prestigious universities. They specifically asked for provisions preventing the children from accessing funds for anything beyond education and basic living expenses during their studies. I felt a complex emotion rise, something between pride and vindication. Robert's belief that our children could learn better financial habits if properly motivated seemed to be proving true, even if the path had been far more dramatic than either of us had envisioned. What about their community service commitments? I asked, scanning the formal reports in the folders. Have they maintained them beyond the required period? David nodded. Thomas has increased his hours at the legal aid clinic. He's apparently developing materials specifically addressing financial exploitation of seniors based on what he's learned both from his own actions and the cases he's witnessed. Patty has expanded her work at the senior center to include a weekly social event she organizes. Her background in event planning seems to have found a more meaningful outlet. And the family counseling? This was perhaps the most important element to me personally, beyond the financial rehabilitation. Dr. Moretti's assessment is in the third folder, David said. She's cautiously positive about the progress, though she notes there's still significant work to be done regarding underlying patterns of entitlement and materialistic values. I took a moment to digest this information, watching another leaf spiral down from the maple tree. A year ago, I had been prepared to sever ties with my children completely, the betrayal too profound to imagine any path forward. Now, we were cautiously rebuilding something that, while never the same as before, might eventually be something authentic rather than obligatory. Thank you, David, I said finally. Not just for today's update, but for everything throughout this past year. Without your guidance and Robert's foresight, I might well be sitting in a small room at Sunshine Valley right now, my home sold and my autonomy stripped away. David's expression softened. Robert knew exactly what he was doing when he structured that LLC. He loved those kids, but he had no illusions about their financial judgment. The real victory, though, is seeing them actually grow from this experience, rather than simply finding new ways to pursue the same old patterns. After reviewing the remainder of the documentation, David took his leave, reminding me that we would need to schedule a more formal annual review of the LLC with Thomas and Patty present before the month's end. I spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing for the evening's dinner, my mind processing the surprising developments David had shared. Thomas and Patty arrived separately, but within minutes of each other, another change from the coordinated front they had once presented. Thomas brought a modest bottle of wine, while Patty carried a homemade pie for dessert. Small gestures, but meaningful in their normality. "The garden looks beautiful, Mom," Patty commented as we moved through the house toward the dining room. "Those chrysanthemums along the walkway are stunning." "Barbara and I planted them last weekend," I replied. "Part of our ongoing project to enhance the seasonal color." "Barbara's knee surgery is next month, right?" Thomas asked, setting the wine on the sideboard. "Is there anything you need help with while she's recovering? I could come by and take care of the yard work, make sure the leaves don't get ahead of you." The offer seemed genuine rather than strategic, another small indication of the shift in our dynamics over the past year. "That would be helpful," I acknowledged. "Though I've arranged for her to stay here during her initial recovery, so I'll have company in the house." "Good," Thomas nodded. "You shouldn't be handling everything alone while she's recovering." The dinner itself proceeded with a comfortable rhythm that would have seemed impossible 12 months earlier. We discussed ordinary family matters, Thomas's daughter's college applications, Patty's son's soccer team reaching the regional finals. Not the forced pleasantries of our early post-confrontation interactions, but not the easy familiarity of our life before the betrayal either. Something new, cautiously constructed on a foundation of accountability rather than assumption. As we moved to coffee and Patty's pie in the living room, I decided to address the reports David had shared earlier. "I had my annual review meeting with David this afternoon," I began, watching their reactions carefully. "He shared your financial counseling progress reports." Neither flinched or looked defensive, another notable change from months past. "What did you think?" Thomas asked directly. "I'm impressed with the progress you've both made," I said honestly. "Not just in meeting the requirements, but in seemingly embracing the purpose behind them." Patty nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "The financial literacy program at the senior center has changed my perspective significantly. These people worked their entire lives, made careful decisions, and still found themselves vulnerable, often to their own families. It's made me reassess everything about how Greg and I were managing our finances. The downsizing decision must have been difficult," I observed, referencing what David had shared about their home sale. "Less difficult than you might think," Patty replied. "Once we let go of worrying about what the neighbors would think, or whether we were in the right neighborhood, it became liberating. The new house requires so much less upkeep, our monthly expenses have dropped dramatically, and the kids are actually happier at the public school than they were at Westridge Academy, which says a lot about how much of our decisions were based on appearances rather than actual quality of life," Thomas added. "I've been learning the same lesson with my business. The high-profile development projects I used to chase were all about creating the appearance of success, not actual sustainable income. The property management contracts I'm focusing on now aren't glamorous, but they're stable and actually allow me to sleep at night." Their self-awareness seemed genuine rather than performed for my benefit. Dr. Moretti had warned me to watch for the difference between actual growth and strategic compliance, the latter characterized by telling me what they thought I wanted to hear rather than demonstrating authentic change. "David mentioned you've requested a modification to the proceeds from your house sale." I said to Patty, curious to hear her direct explanation. She nodded. We want the difference placed in an educational trust for the kids, structured to emphasize practical career preparation. We've been thinking a lot about the patterns we were establishing for them, the emphasis on status and appearance over substance and stability. This feels like a concrete way to help them avoid the same mistakes we made. The irony isn't lost on us, Thomas added with a rueful smile. Dad structured the LLC to protect you from our poor financial judgment, and now we're creating similar protections for our own kids. Apparently, financial responsibility in our family requires external guardrails. The self-deprecating humor represented perhaps the most significant change in Thomas's approach. A year ago, any suggestion that his financial judgment was flawed would have triggered immediate defensiveness or anger. Your father would be pleased, I said after a moment. Not about the circumstances that led us here, but about the lessons finally taking root. That was always his hope, not to control or punish, but to create opportunity for genuine change. I wish we'd listened earlier, Patty said quietly. Before it took what it took. The reference to their scheme hung in the air for a moment, not avoided as in the early months after the confrontation, but not needing explicit naming either. We had discussed it extensively in our family counseling sessions with Dr. Moretti, naming the actions and motivations directly rather than through euphemism or justification. I've been thinking about something, Thomas said, changing the subject slightly. The work at the legal aid clinic has shown me how many seniors don't have the protections you had. The foresight Dad showed in creating the LLC structure, the friendship with Barbara that raised the alarm, the relationship with David to navigate the legal complexities. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. During the past year, I'd reflected often on how fortunate I had been compared to many others in similar situations. If Robert hadn't created those protective measures, if Barbara hadn't been alert to the warning signs, if David hadn't been positioned to intervene quickly, my story might have had a very different ending. I've been developing educational materials focused on preventative measures seniors can take, Thomas continued. Simple legal structures that can be implemented before a crisis, warning signs to watch for, community resources available. I'd like to expand it into a more comprehensive program, possibly in partnership with the senior center where Patty volunteers. This suggestion caught me by surprise. Not just the idea itself, but the collaborative approach with his sister. Their relationship had always been cordial, but not particularly close, united primarily in times of crisis or when presenting a common front against parental restrictions. The notion of them working together on a positive initiative seemed both novel and promising. That's an excellent idea, I encouraged. The Senior Center has been looking to expand their educational programming beyond basic financial literacy. We've already discussed it preliminarily, Patty added. Combining Thomas's legal knowledge from the clinic with the relationships I've built at the center could create something really beneficial. We're thinking of calling it the Rogers Family Elder Protection Initiative, if you're comfortable with us using the family name. The suggestion touched me unexpectedly. After everything that had happened, they were proposing to transform the experience into something potentially helpful for others, not to erase their actions, but to create something constructive from the painful recognition of what they had nearly done. I think your father would consider that a fitting legacy, I said carefully. Though I'd want David involved in reviewing all materials to ensure they're legally sound. Absolutely, Thomas agreed immediately. In fact, we were hoping both you and David might consider serving as advisors for the initiative. Your perspective, as someone who experienced this firsthand, would be invaluable. The evening continued with discussion of their preliminary ideas for the initiative, with a depth of thought and genuine concern that further reinforced my cautious optimism about their transformation. Not a complete redemption. The breach of trust had been too profound for that. but a meaningful evolution toward something neither Robert nor I could have anticipated during those worried conversations before his death. As they prepared to leave, Thomas lingered in the foyer while Patty retrieved her coat. "Mom," he said quietly, "I wanted you to know I've been in discussions with the State Bar Association about developing ethics training specifically addressing elder exploitation. As part of that, I've been sharing my own experience, not just professionally, but personally. What I almost did to you." The vulnerability in this admission was striking. Thomas had always been intensely protective of his professional reputation, carefully curating the image he presented to colleagues and potential clients. "That can't be easy," I observed. "It's not," he acknowledged, "but it feels necessary. The most effective cautionary tales often come from those who nearly made irreversible mistakes. If exposing my own ethical failure helps prevent even one other family from experiencing what ours did, the discomfort seems worthwhile." After they had gone, I sat in my living room reflecting on the evening. The house around me, the home that had become the center of such profound conflict, felt different now. Not because of any physical changes, but because my relationship to it had evolved. It was no longer simply the house where I had raised my family or the asset my children had coveted, but a symbol of autonomy preserved and, perhaps, a family cautiously rebuilding from the ashes of betrayal. Barbara called to check in, as she often did after these family dinners. "How did it go?" she asked, her concern evident even through the phone. "Better than I expected," I admitted. They seemed to be genuinely embracing the changes rather than just complying with requirements. They're even talking about creating an educational initiative to help other seniors avoid similar situations. "Transformation through accountability," Barbara observed. "Not what any of us expected a year ago." "No," I agreed. Though Robert might have hoped for something like this when he created those protective measures. He never gave up on the possibility of them growing into more responsible adults, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. "He was right in the end," Barbara said gently, though the path proved far more dramatic than anyone could have anticipated. After we hung up, I found myself drawn to the small mahogany box on my mantel, where I kept Robert's wedding ring alongside the wisdom from his mother that had guided me through the crisis. Pay attention to what people do when they think no. One important is watching. That's when they show you who they really are. The painful irony was that Thomas and Patty had indeed shown me who they were during those desperate days, but they had also demonstrated capacity for change when confronted with the consequences of their actions and offered pathways toward redemption rather than simple punishment. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the complexity of forgiveness, not as a simple act of absolution, but as a gradual process of rebuilding trust through consistent action rather than promises or apologies. My children had betrayed me in a fundamental way, attempting to strip me of both home and autonomy for financial gain. That reality would always be part of our family story, acknowledged rather than erased. Yet alongside that difficult truth, another narrative was cautiously emerging, one of accountability, growth, and transformation. Not a happy ending that minimized harm done, but a complex journey toward something neither perfect nor irredeemable. The house remained mine, secured through Robert's foresight and my own determination, but its meaning had evolved beyond property to become a symbol of both betrayal confronted and, perhaps eventually, a family finding its way toward an authentic connection based not on obligation or advantage, but on earned trust and genuine care. 2 years after discovering my children's scheme, I stood in the community room of the Riverdale Senior Center, watching as Thomas and Patty prepared to present the first formal session of the Rogers Family Elder Protection Initiative. The room was filled with seniors from throughout the community, many of whom I had come to know through my own volunteer work at the center over the past year. David sat beside me in the front row, his portfolio containing the legal materials he had helped develop for the program. Barbara, now fully recovered from her knee replacement surgery, chatted with Dr. Moretti, who had agreed to serve as a consultant for the psychological components of the initiative. "Nervous?" David asked quietly as we watched Thomas adjust the projection screen. "Proud," I corrected him. Not without complexity, but genuinely proud of what they've created from such a difficult beginning. The initiative had evolved far beyond the initial concept Thomas and Patty had described that evening in my living room a year earlier. What began as a simple educational program had developed into a comprehensive support system for vulnerable seniors, combining preventative legal measures, financial literacy education, and community support networks designed to reduce isolation and increase protection. Thomas stepped to the podium, looking more grounded and authentic than I had seen him in years. Gone was the slick real estate developer's carefully cultivated image, replaced by someone more comfortable in his own skin. "Welcome," he began, his voice steady despite the vulnerability inherent in what he was about to share. "The Rogers family. Elder Protection Initiative emerges from a deeply personal story, one that begins not with inspiration, but with failure." A ripple of interest moved through the audience as Thomas continued. 2 years ago, my sister Patty and I conspired to have our mother declared incompetent and placed in a care facility without her knowledge or consent. Our goal was to sell her home and use the proceeds to solve our own financial problems. The directness of this opening clearly caught many attendees by surprise. Thomas had insisted on beginning each session with this personal accountability, despite my suggestion that he could present the material without exposing his own past actions so explicitly. "We fabricated concerns about her mental capacity," he continued, "manipulated her into a facility under false pretenses, and initiated guardianship proceedings based on manufactured evidence. Our plan failed not because the system worked as it should, but because our mother had exceptional protections in place. Protections most seniors don't have." Patty joined him at the podium, her presence reinforcing the unified purpose they had developed around this initiative. "What we attempted is disturbingly common," she added. "What's uncommon is having the foresight and resources to prevent it. Through my work at this very senior center over the past 2 years, I've witnessed dozens of stories similar to what might have happened to our mother if she hadn't been so well prepared." As they continued outlining the initiative's components, the key legal protections, the financial safeguards, the community connections, I felt a complex emotion that defied simple categorization. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that something meaningful had emerged from what could have been solely destructive. After the formal presentation, as attendees browsed through the materials and signed up for individual consultations, Barbara leaned close to me. "When you called me from Sunshine Valley 2 years ago," she said quietly, "I never imagined we'd end up here. I was preparing to help you cut ties with them completely." "As was I acknowledged. The betrayal seemed too fundamental to move beyond. Yet here we are," she observed, watching as Thomas explained a legal document to an elderly couple while Patty guided another senior toward the financial literacy resources. "Here we are," I echoed. Not because what they did wasn't serious, but because they were willing to do the difficult work of genuine accountability rather than simply avoiding consequences. Dr. Moretti joined our conversation, having overheard this last exchange. "What you've all managed to create is quite remarkable from a psychological perspective," she noted. "Not just the reconciliation within your family, but this transformation of harm into something constructive. It's the difference between simple apology and true amends. The latter requires creating something positive from the recognition of wrong done." The initiative's launch continued throughout the afternoon, with more attendees arriving as word spread through the senior community. I observed from a slight distance, allowing Thomas and Patty to fully own both the project and the accountability that had sparked it. David approached with 2 elderly brothers I recognized from my volunteer work at the center. "Eleanor, the Petersons have a question about the trust structure Thomas described." I thought you might want to share your personal experience with its effectiveness. Over the next hour, I found myself engaged in several such conversations. Seniors, asking not just about legal protections, but about the emotional experience of discovering betrayal from those closest to me. I answered honestly, neither minimizing the pain nor denying the possibility of meaningful change when genuine accountability is embraced. As the event wound down, Thomas, Patty, and I found ourselves alone in the community room, gathering materials and reflecting on the day's success. 27 people signed up for individual consultations, Patty reported, reviewing the registration sheets. And the center director has already asked us to schedule 3 additional sessions based on the response. The Bar Association has expressed interest in using the materials for their continuing education program, Thomas added. They believe it could be adapted for attorneys working in elder law and estate planning. I watched my children, no longer the desperate conspirators who had tricked me into Sunshine Valley, nor the chastened defendants facing the consequences of their actions, but adults who had found purpose in transforming their worst mistake into something beneficial for others. Your father would be proud, I said simply. Not of how we arrived here, but of what you've created from that difficult beginning. For a moment, I glimpsed the flicker of old pain cross both their faces, the recognition of what their actions had cost, not just in terms of our family relationships, but in betraying the values their father had tried to instill despite his concerns about their financial judgment. We found his letters, Patty said quietly. When we were clearing out our old house for the downsizing, a whole file of them in his desk. Letters he wrote to each of us but never sent. About his worries for our financial choices. His hope that we would eventually learn to value security over appearance. He knew us better than we knew ourselves, Thomas acknowledged. He saw exactly where our priorities would lead if unchecked. Everything he predicted in those letters came to pass. The over-leveraged properties, the status-seeking expenditures we couldn't afford, eventually culminating in. He paused, still finding it difficult to directly name their scheme even, after discussing it publicly, what we tried to do to you. As we finished gathering the materials and made our way to the parking lot, I was struck by how far we had traveled from that confrontation in my kitchen 2 years earlier. Not a journey I would have chosen or could have anticipated, but one that had ultimately led to something more authentic than the superficial family relationships we had maintained before the crisis. Dinner at my house next Sunday? I suggested as we reached our cars. Barbara's making her famous pot roast. They both nodded, accepting with a natural ease that had gradually replaced the tension of our early post-confrontation interactions. Not perfect, not unmarked by the past, but genuine in a way our relationship hadn't been for many years before the betrayal. Later that evening, as Barbara and I sat in my sunroom enjoying the spring twilight, I found myself reflecting on the strange path that had brought us to this point. "Penny, for your thoughts," she asked, noticing my contemplative mood. "I was thinking about choices," I replied. "Not just theirs, but mine. 2 years ago, I could have pursued legal action, foreclosed on their homes, severed ties completely. All justified responses to what they had done. No one would have blamed you," Barbara agreed. "I certainly was advocating for the strictest approach in those early days." Yet something held me back from that finality, I continued. Not just sentimentality or family obligation, but some intuition that there might be potential for growth if given the right structure and consequences. "Robert's influence," Barbara suggested. "He always believed in redemption through accountability, not punishment for its own sake." "Perhaps," I acknowledged. "Or maybe just the perspective that comes from 70 years of watching people make mistakes, learn, and sometimes transform. The wisdom to see that people are rarely their worst actions exclusively, even when those actions are deeply painful." As darkness settled over the garden Robert and I had tended for decades, I felt a sense of peace that had seemed impossible in the aftermath of discovering my children's betrayal. Not because that betrayal had been erased or minimized, but because it had ultimately led to a more honest reckoning with the patterns that had shaped our family for generations: the prioritization of appearance over substance, the avoidance of difficult truths in favor of comfortable illusions. The house remained mine, secured through Robert's foresight and my own determination. But its meaning had expanded beyond mere property to become the setting for a family story more complex and ultimately more authentic than the one we had told ourselves before the crisis forced us to confront uncomfortable truths. "You know what still amazes me?" Barbara asked as we prepared to head inside against the evening chill. "What's that?" "How something genuinely good emerged from something so terrible. Not because the terrible thing was justified, but because everyone involved made choices afterward that transformed it into something meaningful." Her observation captured precisely what I had been contemplating. The initiative launched today hadn't erased or excused what Thomas and Patty had done, but it had created purpose from pain, meaning from betrayal, not through forgetting, but through remembering and transforming. The home that had once been the focus of such destructive scheming had become a gathering place for a family finding its way toward something more truthful than what had existed before. Not despite the betrayal, but because of the difficult, ongoing work of building something authentic from its painful recognition. 5 years had passed since that fateful day when I walked out of Sunshine Valley Care Center to discover my children had listed my home for sale. At 75, I found myself sitting in the same garden where Robert and I had spent countless summer evenings, now transformed by 5 years of careful attention from both Barbara and me. The roses he had loved so much were in full bloom, their fragrance carrying on the warm June breeze. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the backyard, where Thomas's teenage daughter Lily and Patty's son Michael were setting up lawn games for the anniversary celebration. 5 years since the confrontation in my kitchen, 3 years since the launch of the Rogers Family Elder Protection Initiative, and today marked another milestone I could never have anticipated during those dark days of betrayal. "Grandma Eleanor," Lily called, appearing around the corner of the house. "The first guests are arriving. Uncle David just pulled up." I smiled at her use of uncle for David, a designation that had evolved naturally as he became more integrated into our extended family gatherings over the years. At 17, Lily had blossomed into a thoughtful young woman who bore little resemblance to the status-conscious child her parents had been raising before their financial awakening. "I'll be right there," I assured her, gathering the folder of program materials I had been reviewing. The Rogers Initiative had grown beyond any of our initial expectations, expanding from local educational sessions to a statewide network of resources for vulnerable seniors. Today's gathering celebrated both that growth and something more personal: the official announcement that Thomas and Patty would be taking over full leadership of the initiative as I stepped into an advisory role. David met me at the garden gate, his familiar leather portfolio tucked under his arm despite the festive occasion. Some habits never changed, even in retirement. "The guest of honor," he greeted me warmly. "How are you feeling about today?" "Reflective," I admitted as we walked together toward the gathering crowd. 5 years ago, I couldn't have imagined being in the same room with Thomas and Patty without feeling that knot of betrayal. Now we're celebrating a joint accomplishment that grew from that very pain. David nodded thoughtfully. Robert always believed in transformative accountability, rather than punitive justice. He would see this as vindication of his approach, painful as the path has been. The backyard had been transformed for the occasion. White chairs arranged in neat rows faced a small podium positioned beneath the oak tree Robert and I had preserved during our home's renovation decades earlier. Banners, displaying the Rogers Initiative logo, an open hand supporting a house, hung between posts along the garden perimeter. Barbara approached, moving more slowly at 80 but still radiating the straightforward energy that had literally saved me from my children's scheme 5 years earlier. After her knee replacement, She had sold her own home and moved permanently into my East Wing, an arrangement that benefited us both as we navigated the challenges of advancing age. "Quite a turnout," she observed, nodding toward the assembling guests. "The governor's aide just arrived, and there's that state senator who's been championing elder protection legislation." The attendance reflected how far the initiative had expanded beyond our personal family redemption project. What began as Thomas and Patty's attempt to make amends had evolved into genuine reform that affected thousands of seniors throughout the state. Their financial exploitation legislation, drafted with input from seniors who had experienced similar betrayals, had been signed into law the previous year. Thomas approached, the confidence in his bearing now authentic rather than the practiced facade he had once maintained. At 50, he had developed a reputation as one of the region's leading advocates for elder protection, a transformation so complete that few outside our immediate circle knew his advocacy had emerged from confronting his own worst actions. "The Dadi State Bar Association president is here," he reported, "and 3 members of the legislative committee working on next year's expanded protections bill. This is becoming quite the influential gathering." "As it should be," I replied. "What you and Patty have built deserves this recognition." Thomas's expression softened. "What we built together, Mom. None of this would exist without your willingness to offer a path toward redemption rather than just punishment. That was the harder choice, and I've never forgotten it." Patty joined us, clipboard in hand, as she managed the event with the same organizational skills she had once directed toward maintaining appearances. Now 48, she had channeled her talents into expanding the initiative's financial literacy programs, creating curriculum specifically designed to help seniors recognize and resist exploitation. "We're ready to begin whenever you are," she informed me. Though Michael is still setting up the photo display, chronicling the initiative's growth. The display had been my suggestion, a visual documentation of the journey from family crisis to community resource, not sanitizing the difficult beginning, but illustrating how accountability could lead to meaningful change when embraced fully rather than superficially. As guests settled into their seats, I took my place near the podium where Thomas and Patty would make the official leadership transition announcement. Barbara sat beside me, her presence a reminder of how genuine friendship had proven more reliable than family ties in my moment of greatest vulnerability. The ceremony began with Thomas welcoming everyone and acknowledging the initiative's unusual origin. True to the principle of transparency we had established from the beginning, he made no attempt to soften the reality of where our journey had begun. The Rogers Family Elder Protection Initiative emerged from a profound failure, he stated clearly. 5 years ago, my sister Patty and I conspired to have our mother declared incompetent and placed in a care facility against her will, with the intention of selling her home for our own financial benefit. A murmur moved through the audience, some hearing this origin story for the first time, others familiar with the narrative that had become central to the initiative's identity. We were stopped not because the system worked effectively, but because our mother had exceptional protections in place, protections most seniors lack. What began as our personal attempt at amends has grown into a mission to ensure that all seniors have access to similar safeguards, regardless of their financial or social resources. Patty joined him at the podium, continuing the narrative, with the same unflinching honesty. Over the past 5 years, we've worked alongside our mother to transform that painful beginning into something constructive. The legislative reforms, educational programs, and community networks we've established together have helped thousands of seniors maintain their autonomy and security. As they continued outlining the initiative's growth and future direction, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this moment. Not a journey I would have chosen, certainly not one I could have envisioned during those desperate days at Sunshine Valley, yet one that had ultimately led to something meaningful beyond our family's private reconciliation. When it came time For my remarks, I approached the podium with the same confidence I had once brought to my role as a school principal. The faces before me represented not just supporters of the initiative, but witnesses to a transformation that defied conventional expectations of family betrayal. 5 years ago, I began, I discovered that my children had conspired to have me declared incompetent, institutionalized, and stripped of my home. Today, we stand before you as partners in an initiative that has helped secure thousands of other seniors against similar exploitation. I paused, allowing the contrast to register with the audience. This transformation didn't happen through simple forgiveness or by minimizing the betrayal. It emerged through difficult, consistent work toward accountability and repair, not just words of apology, but sustained action to create meaning from painful recognition. Looking out at the gathering, I was struck by how many seniors from the center were present. Individuals who had benefited from the initiative's programs or contributed their own experiences to shaping its approach. Their presence offered powerful testimony to the impact of what had grown from our family's darkest chapter. Today marks a transition in leadership, as Thomas and Patty assume full direction of the initiative, while I step into an advisory role. This natural evolution represents not just organizational growth, but the completion of a personal journey from victims and perpetrators of exploitation to collaborative advocates for systemic change. After the formal ceremony concluded, the gathering transitioned to a celebration with refreshments served throughout the garden. I found myself engaged in conversations with legislators, advocates, and seniors whose lives had been directly impacted by the initiative's work. "Your story gave me courage," confided Mrs. Simmons, an 83-year-old who had attended one of our very first educational sessions. I recognized the same warning signs with my nephew, suddenly so interested in my financial affairs, suggesting I was becoming forgetful when I wasn't. Because of what I learned through your program, I knew to contact an attorney immediately and establish protections. Such testimonials had become increasingly common as the initiative expanded, each one reinforcing that our family's painful experience had transcended personal reconciliation to create meaningful change for others facing similar vulnerability. As the celebration continued, I noticed Thomas deep in conversation with State Senator Harrison, the primary sponsor of the elder protection legislation. Their discussion appeared animated, with Thomas gesturing emphatically as he made some point about implementation details. "He's advocating for stronger enforcement mechanisms in next year's amendments," David explained, following my gaze. The senator wanted to water down certain provisions to ease passage, but Thomas is pushing back rather effectively. He's become quite the formidable advocate. "From exploiter to protector," Barbara observed, joining our conversation, a transition none of us could have predicted 5 years ago. "People contain multitudes," I replied, watching as Patty now joined the discussion, adding her perspective to whatever point Thomas was making. "The capacity for both terrible harm and meaningful repair often coexists within the same person. The question is which potential they ultimately actualize through their choices." Later, as the gathering began to disperse, I found myself alone in the garden with Thomas and Patty. The formal transition complete, the celebration successful beyond our expectations, we took a moment to acknowledge the personal significance of this milestone among ourselves. "I've been thinking about Dad today," Patty said quietly, gazing at the roses he had so carefully tended. "About how differently things might have gone if we'd actually listened to his financial guidance instead of resenting it as control." "He saw the path we were on long before we did," Thomas acknowledged. "The LLC he created to protect Mom from. Exactly what we tried to do. It wasn't just practical foresight. It was emotional wisdom about his own children's worst tendencies." I listened to their reflections, struck by how far we had traveled from the defensive justifications of those early post-confrontation days. Their ability to name their actions and motivations directly, without minimizing or deflecting, represented perhaps the most significant aspect of their transformation. Your father believed in redemption through accountability, I said after a moment. Not punishment for its own sake, but consequences structured to create opportunity for genuine growth. The protective measures he established were designed not just to shield me from harm, but to offer you both a pathway toward better choices if you were willing to embrace it. It took something this extreme to break through, Thomas admitted. All those years of financial advice, gentle suggestions about living within our means, none of it penetrated until we were forced to confront what we'd become capable of. The initiative has been part of that confrontation, Patty added. Having to publicly acknowledge our actions with every presentation, every program launch, it's created a kind of ongoing accountability that keeps us from ever minimizing what happened. As twilight descended over the garden, we made our way inside where Barbara had prepared coffee and dessert for a final gathering of just our immediate circle. David, Barbara, Thomas, Patty, and the grandchildren who had returned from delivering leftover refreshments to the senior center. Lily approached me as I settled into my favorite chair in the living room. At 17, she had developed an interest in elder law, inspired partly by her father's work with the initiative and partly by her own evolving understanding of what had transpired in our family. "Grandma, I've been thinking about something," she began with a seriousness beyond her years. "About what happens to the initiative when—" She hesitated, searching for delicate phrasing. "When I'm no longer here?" I suggested gently. She nodded, relieved I had bridged the awkward gap. The transition today made me realize how much of the initiative's identity is tied to your personal story, all of your stories. How does that continue into the next generation? Her question caught the attention of the others, conversation pausing as they tuned into our exchange. It was a perceptive observation. The initiative's power had always been partly rooted in the authentic transformation it represented, the lived experience behind its programs and materials. "That's actually something we've been discussing," Thomas responded, glancing toward Patty for confirmation. "The initiative needs to evolve beyond our personal narrative if it's going to have lasting impact. We're creating an oral history project," Patty explained, documenting not just our family's experience, but stories from dozens of seniors who've faced exploitation or vulnerability. Creating a tapestry of testimonials that ensures no single narrative, including ours, becomes essential to the work. David nodded approvingly, institutionalizing the wisdom without depending on the original wisdom bearers. That's how meaningful change outlasts its founders. As the evening progressed into deeper conversation about the initiative's future, I found myself watching the interactions with a sense of wonder at how thoroughly our family dynamic had transformed. Not erasing the betrayal that had initiated this journey, but building something meaningful atop its painful foundation. Later, after everyone had departed except Barbara, who was already preparing for bed in her wing of the house, I lingered in the garden for a final moment of reflection. The home that had been the center of such dramatic conflict 5 years earlier had evolved into something more complex than mere property. A symbol of autonomy preserved, family painfully reconstructed, and purpose discovered in the aftermath of betrayal. Robert's mother's wisdom about paying attention to what people do when they think no one important is watching had guided me through the crisis of discovering my children's scheme. Yet the years since had taught me something equally valuable, that people can sometimes transcend their worst actions when confronted with both consequences and opportunity for meaningful repair. The house remained mine, secured through Robert's foresight and my own determination. But its significance had expanded beyond personal sanctuary to become headquarters for work that would continue beyond my lifetime. Work born from painful recognition of vulnerability shared by countless seniors lacking the protections that had saved me from my children's scheme. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself drawn to the photograph album I kept on my nightstand. Images documenting not just our family across decades, but the evolution of the initiative over the past 5 years. The progression told A story more complex than simple redemption, more meaningful than mere punishment or forgiveness. It illustrated how accountability, when embraced fully rather than superficially, could sometimes transform harm into healing that extended far beyond those directly involved. 5 years after discovering my children's betrayal, I had found my way to a recognition both clear-eyed and compassionate. That family, like all human relationships, exists in the messy middle ground between idealization and rejection. That meaningful connection requires acknowledging hard truths rather than maintaining comfortable illusions, and that sometimes the most profound growth emerges from confronting our capacity for harm rather than denying or minimizing it. The house on Maple Street stood as testimony to this complex understanding. Not just a home preserved against exploitation, but the setting for a family's difficult journey towards something more authentic than what had existed before the betrayal, forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and each other. 10 years had passed since I walked out of Sunshine Valley Care Center to discover Thomas and Patty staging my house for sale. At 80, I found myself once again in my garden, though this time seated in a wheelchair as I recovered from a hip replacement surgery 2 months earlier. The roses Robert had planted decades ago still bloomed magnificently, tended now by Barbara's grandniece, who visited weekly to help with the more physically demanding garden tasks. The Rogers Family Elder Protection Initiative had expanded beyond anything we could have envisioned during those early days of family crisis and tentative reconciliation. What began as Thomas and Patty's attempt to make amends had evolved into a nationally recognized model for elder protection, with programs operating in 12 states and pending legislation in 4 more. Thomas, now 55, had transitioned from real estate entirely to serve as the initiative's full-time executive director, bringing his business acumen and personal testimony to expand our reach and influence. Patty, at 53, directed our educational programs, having discovered a genuine talent for curriculum development that transformed complex legal concepts into accessible guidance for vulnerable seniors. Today's gathering was more intimate than the leadership transition celebration 5 years earlier. Just family and a few close friends assembled in the garden to mark a decade of both personal healing and public impact. "Ready for your grand entrance?" Barbara asked from behind my wheelchair. At 85, she had slowed considerably, but remained determined to maintain her independence, now using a walker that she navigated with characteristic stubbornness. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, smoothing the light summer dress I had chosen for the occasion. Barbara guided my wheelchair along the flagstone path toward the oak tree where chairs had been arranged in a semicircle rather than the formal rows of previous gatherings. This wasn't a public event, but a private commemoration, an acknowledgement of how far we had traveled from that desperate day when Barbara had helped me escape from Sunshine Valley and return home to confront my children's betrayal. Lily, now 22 and in her first year of law school with a focus on elder law, spotted us first. "Grandma's here," she called to the others, coming to take over wheelchair duty from Barbara, who gratefully transferred to her walker. "You look wonderful," Lily assured me as she navigated toward the gathering. "How's the hip feeling today?" "Better every day," I replied truthfully. The recovery had been challenging but steady, supported by the network of care Barbara and I had established for each other as we navigated the physical vulnerabilities of advancing age. David rose as we approached, looking distinguished at 78, despite the cane he now relied upon. Though officially retired, he remained actively involved with the initiative as legal counsel and had become an integral part of our extended family gatherings over the past decade. "The guest of honor arrives," he announced warmly, the others turning to welcome us into the circle. Thomas stood to help position my wheelchair in the space they had reserved, his touch gentle and respectful, a far cry from the manipulative guidance he had once used to escort me into Sunshine Valley under false pretenses. Patty approached with a light blanket for my legs, the June breeze carrying a slight chill despite the sunshine. "Perfect timing," she noted. We were just about to begin the remembrance circle. The tradition had evolved over years of initiative, events, participants sharing reflections about their personal journeys and the impact of our work. For this private gathering, however, the focus was more intimate, how the crisis that had nearly destroyed our family had ultimately transformed not just our relationships with each other, but our understanding of purpose and meaning. "Who would like to begin?" David asked once Barbara and I were comfortably settled. "I will," offered Thomas, his confidence now grounded in authentic accomplishment rather than the superficial success he had once chased so desperately. 10 years ago today, I stood in Mom's kitchen watching my carefully constructed plan collapse around me. I had convinced myself that placing her in Sunshine Valley was necessary protection, not exploitation. That selling her home was practical downsizing, not theft. He paused, the decade of therapeutic work and public accountability evident in his ability to name his actions directly without defensive qualifiers. What I couldn't see then was how thoroughly my priorities had become distorted. Success defined by acquisition rather than contribution. Worth measured by appearance rather than substance. The confrontation that day was devastating, but necessary. It began a process of reconsidering everything I thought I understood about what makes a life meaningful. Patty nodded in agreement. For me, the most profound change has been in how I understand family itself. Before, I saw it primarily as obligation and inheritance, roles to fulfill, appearances to maintain, assets to anticipate. Now I recognize it as a complex, challenging opportunity for genuine connection that requires honesty rather than performance. She glanced toward me, her expression reflecting the nuanced relationship we had gradually built over the past decade. Not the superficial harmony of our pre-crisis interactions, nor the raw damage of the immediate aftermath, but something more, authentic that acknowledged both the harm done and the healing attempted. The initiative became a vessel for that transformation, she continued, not just making amends through action rather than apology, but discovering purpose in translating our family's painful experience into protection for others. As the circle continued, each person sharing their perspective on the decade's journey, I found myself reflecting on how profoundly my own understanding had evolved. The betrayal had been real and devastating, my children conspiring to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized for financial gain. That reality would always be part of our family story, acknowledged rather than erased. Yet alongside that difficult truth, another narrative had emerged, one of accountability embraced, harm transformed, and meaning created from painful recognition. Not a happy ending that minimized the breach of trust, but a complex journey toward something neither perfect nor irredeemable. When my turn came to speak, I took a moment to gather thoughts that had been developing throughout the decade of reconciliation and purpose-finding. 10 years ago, I began, I faced what felt like the ultimate betrayal, my own children attempting to strip me of both home and autonomy for their financial benefit. Today, we gather to acknowledge not just that painful beginning, but the extraordinary journey that followed. I looked around the circle at the faces of those who had been part of this transformation. Thomas and Patty, whose worst actions had ultimately catalyzed their most meaningful contributions. David, whose legal expertise had protected me in crisis, and then helped build something constructive from its aftermath. Barbara, whose friendship had proven more reliable than family ties when I was most vulnerable. And the younger generation, who had witnessed both betrayal and redemption as they formed their own understanding of family and ethics. What I've learned through this decade is that meaningful healing doesn't come from forgetting harm done or pretending it never happened. It emerges from acknowledging painful truths and then choosing to create something constructive from their recognition. I gestured toward the house behind us, the home that had been the center of such dramatic conflict 10 years earlier. This house remains mine, secured through Robert's foresight and my own determination. but its meaning has evolved beyond property to become a symbol of both betrayal confronted and purpose discovered. The initiative that grew from our family, Crisis has helped thousands of seniors secure their own homes and autonomy against similar exploitation. As the gathering continued into the afternoon, conversations flowing naturally between reflection on the past and plans for the future, I found myself observing the interactions with a sense of wonder at life's unexpected turns. The children, who had once conspired to place me in a nursing home, had become dedicated advocates for elder protection. The home they had attempted to sell had become headquarters for work that would continue beyond all our lifetimes. Later, as twilight settled over the garden and most guests had departed, I remained outside with Barbara, enjoying the evening air and the peaceful conclusion to a meaningful day. 10 years, she mused, her walker positioned beside her chair. Sometimes it seems impossible that so much has changed since I came to Sunshine Valley pretending to be your sister. And sometimes it feels like that was another lifetime entirely, I replied. Another family, another version of all of us. Not entirely different, Barbara corrected gently. The seeds of who Thomas and Patty have become were always there, just overshadowed by misaligned priorities and values. And you were always the woman strong enough to demand accountability rather than accepting manipulation, even from your own children. Her observation captured something essential about our journey. Not a transformation into entirely different people, but a realignment that allowed previously submerged capacities for both harm and healing to find their proper expression. You know what still amazes me most? I said after a comfortable silence had settled between us. What's that? How something genuinely meaningful grew from something so painful. Not because the pain was necessary or justified, but because everyone involved made choices afterward that transformed its meaning. As darkness descended fully over the garden, Thomas came to help guide my wheelchair back inside, his movements gentle and attentive. The house welcomed us with warm light spilling from windows. The same colonial home on Maple Street where Robert and I had raised our family, where our children had staged their betrayal, and where we had subsequently built something none of us could have anticipated from the ashes of that crisis. The Rogers Family Elder Protection Initiative would continue its work long after all of us were gone, helping vulnerable seniors secure their homes and autonomy against exploitation. Not because our family was exceptional in our capacity for either betrayal or redemption, but because we had discovered how to transform painful recognition into meaningful action that extended beyond our private reconciliation. The house remained standing, its foundation solid beneath renovations and adaptations that had gradually transformed it from a family home to initiative headquarters. But the true legacy wasn't found in property or possessions. It resided in the complex understanding that had emerged from our family's darkest chapter. That sometimes, meaningful purpose can grow from painful recognition, not despite the betrayal, but because of the difficult, ongoing work of creating something authentic from its aftermath. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.